So a feature that I used in my example of an external content type, and it's often used together with BCS, is something called the Secure Store Service. This replaces something known as single sign-on that existed in SharePoint 2007. What the Secure Store Service allows us to do is handle credentials very securely. We don't have to store a username and password in the page for anyone to see. Now, this must be set up by your system administrator because it's going to create an encrypted database that lets SharePoint securely store multiple sets of credentials for external systems. After it's set up, the system administrator defines what are called applications. Now, applications sound complex, but they're actually really, really simple. They're basically just a name and a list of what needs to be stored, usually just the username and password. So an application is defined for each separate database or line of business system or web service or whatever it is you need to connect to. No connectivity information is provided, simply give it a name, like say, I'm creating an application called Salesforce that should store a username and a password, or I'm creating an application called PubsDB that needs to store a username and password. They can be stored per individual, or they can be stored on the group level as well. Individual is more common. The situation is that you now have the Secure Store Service and its database as part of this whole picture between you on your PC, the SharePoint server, the external system, and this new Secure Store Service. So let's say Bob opens up the browser on his PC and makes a request for a SharePoint page. The page is using an external content type. And if it's been defined with the Secure Store Service, SharePoint will automatically make a request to that database and say, hey, do I have credentials for Bob? If no credentials are found, what then happens is this login page is automatically generated and sent back to the browser, sent back to Bob. Bob then provides his credentials. Those go back through, passed through SharePoint and stored in the Secure Store Service, then retrieved for that SharePoint page, and we use those permissions to connect to the external system. Next time around, whether it's a day or an hour later or a week later, Bob opens his browser, makes a request to SharePoint. SharePoint looks to the Secure Store Service, says, yes, we still do have those credentials for Bob, securely retrieves them, and uses those to connect to the external system. And all you really need to do to have this work is just turn this on. You don't have to create the login page. It will be generated automatically. If you saw in my example of using the external list, the first time I tried to view it, it asked me to provide that authentication, the username and password. For requests after that, it was fine. It just let me through. Now, if your system administrator hasn't ever set up the Secure Store Service, that will need to get done. It doesn't take very long. Most of the heavy lifting is done internally in SharePoint. And after that, each new application that represents each external system can be added in minutes. And in SharePoint Designer, all you need to do when you're creating external content types is know the name of the application in the Secure Store Service, and SharePoint will do everything else.